In January 2001, what should have been an ordinary morning in Corpus Christi, Texas, turned into a blood-soaked nightmare for the Perez family. Inside a modest home, 24-year-old Erida Perez Salazar, her 3-year-old son Jacob, and her mother Alma were brutally attacked in a frenzy of violence that would leave the entire community shaken. José Luis Villegas Jr., Erida's ex-boyfriend, stormed into the house fueled by rage and cocaine. Within minutes, Erida was stabbed 32 times. Alma, the family's pillar, suffered 35 stab wounds herself. And little Jacob, just 3 years old, was stabbed 19 times before Viegas fled, stealing a television and a car as if nothing had happened. What makes this crime even more haunting is that Viegas wasn't a stranger. He was once trusted, once part of their lives. And yet, his uncontrollable violence destroyed 3 generations in one morning. To understand how a troubled man became the architect of such carnage, and what he said moments before his execution, we have to go back to the very beginning. But first, hit subscribe and tap the bell icon because this is the kind of case that stays with you long after the screen fades to black. José Luis Villegas Jr. was born on April 14, 1975, in Nueces County, Texas, a region known for its working-class families, its struggles with poverty, and its battles with drugs and crime that often lured young men down dark paths. From the very beginning, Villegas' life seemed to be shaped by hardship. He came of age in an environment where opportunities were scarce, discipline was thin, and survival often meant adapting to the streets rather than thriving in the classroom. By the time most of his peers were looking forward to graduating high school and planning their futures, Villegas had already given up on formal education, dropping out after the 9th grade. That decision would set him on a very different trajectory, one not of ambition and steady work, but of instability, frustration, and a lack of structure that left him vulnerable to the temptations of crime and addiction. Like many young men who slipped through the cracks, Villegas turned to odd jobs to keep himself afloat. He worked in restaurants as a cook and dishwasher, and later picked up work as a laborer, jobs that were physically demanding but paid little and left him without a sense of real progress. These roles, though honest work, were not enough to keep him from drifting toward darker influences. As the years passed, José's life became increasingly defined not by steady employment but by his personal struggles. He developed a serious drug problem, one that clouded his judgment and fueled his volatility. Those around him would later describe a man with a hair-trigger temper, someone who could explode in uncontrollable fits of rage over the smallest provocation. His criminal record began to pile up, each offense painting a clearer picture of a man spiraling out of control. Before the murders that would seal his fate, Villegas already had a disturbing history. He faced charges of sexual assault, he was accused of domestic violence, including punching a woman in the face, and he was no stranger to law enforcement when it came to burglary, threats, and indecency with a child and substance abuse. Each arrest was a warning sign that his life was accelerating toward tragedy, not just for himself, but for anyone unlucky enough to cross him in the wrong moment. Even in court, his attorneys would later try to argue that José Villegas Jr. was not fully in control of his impulses. He was diagnosed with something called intermittent explosive disorder, a condition marked by sudden and intense outbursts of rage that can result in violence. On top of that, his defense would claim he was mentally impaired, pointing to an IQ score of just 59. The morning of January 22, 2001, began like any other in Corpus Christi, Texas, a weekday morning filled with the ordinary rhythms of family life. But inside the Perez household, a storm was about to descend that would leave 3 generations of one family silenced forever. That morning, 25-year-old José Luis Villegas Jr., recently out of jail on bond, arrived at the modest home where his ex-girlfriend, 24-year-old Erida Salazar, was living with her parents and her 2 children. Villegas was not a stranger at this house. In fact, he had once been part of the family's orbit. But the relationship between him and Erida had soured, marked by drugs, volatility, and violence. Despite warnings from her mother not to let him in, Erida opened the door. What followed would become one of the most brutal crimes in Nueces County history. Villegas was due in court later that very day on charges of punching a woman in the face and sexually assaulting her daughter. He already carried 2 prior misdemeanor assault convictions, and his presence in the Perez home that morning was a dangerous omen. By his own confession, once inside, he and Erida consumed around $200 worth of cocaine. The morning slipped into chaos, fueled by drugs and tension as Erida's mother, 51-year-old Alma Perez, returned home after dropping off her granddaughter at school. Alma knew who José was. She knew his background, his temper, his history of violence. She had warned her daughter time and again, "Do not let him into this house." And when she walked through that door and found him there, Her maternal instinct kicked in immediately. She demanded that Viegas leave. But instead of walking out, José snapped. Armed with a kitchen knife, Viegas turned on Alma. In a frenzy of rage, he stabbed her 35 times, silencing the very voice that had tried to protect her family. The brutality was overwhelming. Alma fought, but she was no match for his explosive violence. With Alma gone, Viegas turned his fury on Airida. The young mother, who had once shared her life with this man, became his next target. In a horrific assault, he stabbed Airida 32 times, each wound a reflection of his uncontrollable rage and the broken relationship that had unraveled into deadly violence. And then, in perhaps the most chilling act of all, he turned on the smallest, most innocent victim in the house, 3-year-old Jacob, Airida's son. The little boy, barely old enough to speak full sentences, had no chance to escape. Viegas stabbed him 19 times, ending a life that had only just begun. By the time the attack was over, the house was drenched in horror. 3 lives, spanning 3 generations, had been stolen in the span of minutes. But José Villegas wasn't finished. After the killings, he stole a television set and Airida's vehicle, leaving behind carnage as though it were just another stop in a chaotic day. He later pawned the television for more cash, which he used to buy additional cocaine, fuel for his downward spiral. At approximately 8:45 a.m., a neighbor spotted him leaving the Perez home. Minutes later, around 9:15 a.m., Airida's father, Dionisio Perez, returned from jury duty, having been excused early. What he walked into was every parent and grandparent's nightmare. His wife, his daughter, and his grandson brutally stabbed to death. His cries for help alerted police, and the investigation began immediately. By 9:30 a.m., police spotted Viegas driving Airida's vehicle. A high-speed chase ensued through the streets of Corpus Christi, ending with Viegas abandoning the car and fleeing on foot. Desperate and cornered, he even attempted to provoke officers into shooting him, reportedly shouting and gesturing in a way that suggested he wanted suicide by cop. But instead of killing him, the officers subdued him and placed him under arrest. During the arrest, officers discovered 3 bags of cocaine tucked under his baseball cap. When questioned, Viegas confessed to the murders. Chillingly, he admitted that he had planned to return to the Perez home after buying more cocaine, not to flee, but to commit suicide by overdosing at the very site of his crime. He changed course only when he saw police swarming the scene, forcing him to keep running. Law enforcement officials would later describe the crime scene as one of the most gruesome they had ever encountered. One detective recalled, "The sheer number of stab wounds told us everything we needed to know. This was rage, this was personal, and this was merciless." The killings of Alma, Airida, and little Jacob shocked the entire community. It wasn't just the loss of 3 lives, it was the unimaginable savagery, the complete destruction of a family at the hands of someone who had once been inside their circle of trust. That morning, January 22, 2001, left a scar on Corpus Christi that has never fully healed. And it marked the beginning of the end for José Luis Villegas Jr. In the courtroom, the case against José Villegas escalated to its most crucial and defining stage as prosecutors pursued capital murder charges, a designation reserved only for the gravest and most heinous of crimes. And from the very start of the trial, the prosecution's stance was clear and unyielding. They painted a chilling picture of the murders as acts of brutality carried out without remorse, emphasizing not only the savagery of the killings but also the sheer disregard for human life. While methodically laying out Viegas' prior history of violence to reinforce the narrative that this was not an isolated outburst, but rather part of a pattern of dangerous, escalating behavior, they reminded the jury that this was a man who had previous convictions for assault causing bodily injury in 1999, 2 separate incidents in which he had pleaded guilty, earning a sentence of 90 days in jail for the first conviction and 60 days in jail for the second, and they underscored that his troubles with the law stretched even further back to a 1993 conviction for possession of inhalant paraphernalia, all of which painted him not as a man suddenly overcome by circumstance, but as someone who had walked a long and violent road leading directly to the bloody scene in 2001. On the other side, the defense team did not deny Villegas' involvement in the murders. His lawyers acknowledged in front of the court that he had indeed committed the killings, but they argued with determination that the acts were not intentional in the way the prosecution described, and instead stemmed from his troubled mind. They sought to persuade the jury that José Villegas was not a cold-blooded killer but rather a deeply disturbed individual who had been battling severe mental illness, with his attorneys presenting the testimony of a defense psychiatrist who explained that Villegas suffered from intermittent explosive disorder, a psychological condition characterized by sudden, uncontrollable outbursts of rage and violence that left him powerless in the heat of the moment, his actions more the result of mental instability than deliberate, calculated intent. They even pointed to the diagnosis of intellectual disability, arguing that his impaired reasoning abilities made him less culpable for the decisions he made in that fateful and bloody event. But in the end, the court rejected these defense arguments outright, refusing to accept that mental illness or intellectual disability excused or even mitigated the horror of what had taken place that April day, and instead aligning itself with the prosecution's chilling narrative of brutality, lack of remorse, and an unmistakable pattern of violence. The jury, deeply moved by the evidence and the gruesome details of the crime, ultimately handed down a decisive verdict: conviction on capital murder charges, and with that conviction came the ultimate punishment available under Texas law: the death penalty sentence, sealing José Villegas' fate and ensuring that the justice system would exact the highest possible price for the murders of 3 innocent lives. After the brutal murders that shook Corpus Christi, and following a conviction that seemed airtight in the eyes of the jury, the long and arduous appeals process for José Luis Villegas Jr. began, with his defense team centering their arguments not around innocence, but rather around his mental capacity, a fight that would stretch on for decades and become the focal point of his bid for survival on Texas death row. Attorneys for Villegas presented evidence that he had lived with serious intellectual disabilities throughout his life, pointing to school records, family testimony, and clinical evaluations that consistently showed he functioned at a significantly impaired level. The most striking piece of evidence was an IQ test result of just 59, a score that placed him deep within the range of intellectual disability, and which, according to his defense, made him ineligible for execution under the U.S. Supreme Court's landmark 2002 decision, Atkins v. Virginia. That ruling barred states from executing individuals who were intellectually disabled, declaring it a violation of the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. His attorneys argued passionately that executing a man with such limited mental functioning would not only be unconstitutional but would also betray the moral standards of a civilized society. They painted a picture of a man who had struggled since childhood, a man unable to fully understand the consequences of his actions, a man whose cognitive impairments had left him vulnerable to poor decisions, manipulation, and substance abuse. In their telling, Villegas was not a cold-blooded killer by design but a deeply flawed, impaired human being whose tragic limitations converged with drugs and rage in one of the darkest acts Corpus Christi had ever seen. But the state of Texas saw it very differently. The Texas Attorney General's office countered with their own evidence, pointing out that while Villegas's IQ score was low, other standardized tests had shown higher scores, suggesting that he did not consistently meet the criteria for intellectual disability. They also argued that Villegas was able to live independently, maintain relationships, and even plan the murders, demonstrating levels of reasoning and decision-making far beyond what would be expected of someone with severe mental impairment. More damning to his case was the procedural issue. Prosecutors insisted that his legal team had filed these appeals too late, outside the strict deadlines governing death penalty cases in Texas. To the state, this wasn't just about whether he had a low IQ, it was about the rules of law, and they refused to bend them. The legal battle raged all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, where Villegas's fate hung in the balance. His defense urged the justices to halt the execution, citing Atkins and begging for recognition of his constitutional protection. The case divided the court. While the majority voted to deny relief, four justices dissented, acknowledging that serious questions about Villegas's mental capacity remained unresolved. Despite this glimmer of hope, the denial meant that his execution would proceed as scheduled. The ruling sparked intense public reaction. On one side, advocacy groups for the mentally impaired, human rights organizations, and segments of the public expressed deep sympathy, arguing that executing a man with an IQ of 59 was a gross miscarriage of justice, a step backward in the moral progress of American law. On the other side stood the grieving families of the victims and many Texans who were outraged at what they saw as endless stalling tactics. They argued that no test score could erase the sheer brutality of the murders, 3 innocent lives including a child taken in unspeakable violence. For them, Villegas's impairment was no excuse, and justice demanded that the death penalty be carried out without further delay. In the end, despite nearly 2 decades of legal wrangling, the appeals failed, the court stood firm, and the date of execution was set. José Luis Villegas Jr.'s long fight to avoid the death chamber had ended, not with a reprieve, but with the cold certainty that the state of Texas would not be swayed. On April 16, 2014, after spending 13 long years on death row following his 2001 conviction for the triple murders of his ex-girlfriend, her 3-year-old son, and her mother, José Luis Villegas Jr. was led into the execution chamber at the Walls Unit in Huntsville, Texas, where the state would carry out his death sentence by lethal injection. 4 years, Villegas had lived under the shadow of death, his days marked by the cold monotony of prison routines, appeals, and the growing inevitability of this moment. He had been just 25 years old at the time of the crime in 2001, and now, at 39 years old, he faced the ultimate consequence as the execution date arrived. The weight of those lost years, 13 spent in confinement awaiting the state's final decision, added a grim sense of inevitability to the night's proceedings, underscoring both the brutality of the crime and the long, deliberate process of justice that preceded his death. As the clock ticked toward evening, 6 relatives of the victims gathered quietly behind the glass partition of the chamber to witness the execution. Their presence was palpable but silent. There were no angry outbursts, no audible words of forgiveness, only a heavy, unspoken acknowledgement of the pain and loss that had brought them all to this moment. It was a haunting contrast to the violence of the crime Villegas had committed 13 years earlier, now met with the sterile, calculated finality of state-sanctioned justice. Unlike in decades past when Texas allowed condemned inmates to request a special last meal, Villegas was served only the standard prison fare, a policy change enacted in 2011 that denied condemned men and women the small ritual of culinary choice on their final day. When the curtains parted and he was secured to the gurney, Villegas used his final moments to speak directly to his children. His last words carried a raw simplicity, far removed from the horror of his crimes. "I would like to remind my children once again I love them. Everything is okay. I love you all and I love my children. I am at peace. It does kind of burn. Goodbye, goodbye." The words echoed through the chamber, a mixture of tenderness, resignation, and human vulnerability as the lethal dose coursed through his body. In those few sentences, he sought to leave his children with reassurance rather than despair, attempting, in the only way left to him, to express love and peace despite the circumstances. At precisely 7:04 p.m., after 11 minutes of the drug taking effect, José Luis Villegas Jr. was pronounced dead, becoming yet another name in the long history of executions carried out by Texas. His end was marked by a calmness that stood in stark contrast to the violent acts that had sealed his fate, closing the final chapter of a story defined by brutality, loss, and the relentless march of justice. Justice was finally served in the case of José Villegas, and closure was given to the victim's family. Here's a question for you. Do you believe the death penalty is the ultimate form of justice for such horrific crimes, or should life without parole be the standard punishment? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real and raw true crime stories from death row.